But it's really encouraging that you're chatting with each other, because there is going to be a bit later when I'm going to ask you to do that again. So welcome, thank you so much for coming along, especially at the end of what I know is quite a long day. I am Hannah Jones, and I'm Director of English Language Education at the Centre for Open Learning in the University of Edinburgh. And my talk today is a reflection really on work that I've been doing with colleagues in my institution to kind of engage with and navigate a major university change project that looks at the curriculum in the round. And I'm going to talk about how we engage with that project and how we've been able to kind of use it as a vehicle to drive forward changes in thinking about what EAP is and what role it plays in the institution, sort of repositioning ourselves and claiming a seat at the table. And I'll look at some of the, I'll look at that critically. I'll look at some of the risks as well as the benefits of that engagement, but I will argue that the benefits outweigh the risks. It is very much a sort of reflection on leadership practice, and I can see that there's quite a few leaders in the room, and it probably is of most relevance to people that are leaders or managers or who are aspiring to be leaders and managers. But in the discussion part of the session, there will be an opportunity to connect the themes to your context in a way that I hope is useful and interesting to a wider audience. To start by just giving you a kind of quick overview of what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to start by situating things in the sectoral landscape as I see it at the moment. And it's very much, you know, I don't pretend to be an authority on the sector, but this is kind of how I see it from the vantage point of my institution at the moment. And I'll then move on to talk about this university change project that we've been engaging with, explaining a little bit about what the project is, how we've engaged with it, and including there, a little bit of reflection on how we've been able to successfully make the arguments that we've been able to make. I'll then move on to a closer consideration of the threats and opportunities associated with this engagement, and that's where I'll talk about one of the threats being this sort of perception of complicity potentially with this kind of maybe neoliberal agenda or sort of enemy change project, and I'll sort of talk through that a little bit, and I'll then turn things around to talk about your context. I'm hoping that I'm not going to speak for very much longer than about 20 minutes, leaving about 15 minutes for you to discuss things, for us to come back together and to answer some questions as well at the end. That's actually 15 and then about 5 minutes for the questions, but there's no way it's going to work out that neatly, so we'll see how it goes. So starting with the sectoral landscape. So I think that at the moment, it feels like we are operating in a kind of increasingly dynamic and uncertain terrain. I think this is particularly in the aftermath of COVID, but there are other pressures as well. And I mean, I've put, you can see from the picture on the slide, thinking about industrial action as one of those major pressures that impact us. And I do think that impacts EAP in a particular way because we have quite high rates of casualisation. So overall, I feel like things, certainly as a leader, can feel a bit sort of unstable, maybe a bit difficult to navigate. And I think there's particular reasons for that, some of which I've put on the slide. And one of the main ones is there's instability in our traditional pre-sessional markets. Now, this has been highlighted by the pandemic, but, and you can see there, you probably can't see that, that's a Guardian news article from a couple of years ago talking about the loss of revenue from East Asian international students, thinking about the sector as a whole. Now, it's really key for us in EAP, because depending on how your centre works, it's quite likely that it is fee income from pre-sessional that is in some way funding the rest of your activities. As I said, it depends on your model, but certainly the model that we have in Edinburgh was described this morning by Jennifer MacDonald. I think some of you were in that talk, where she said you can only eat what you kill. So we need to pay for what we do from our revenue generating provisions, and so there are threats there to our other activities, and frankly to the communities of teachers and their employment that's supported by those activities, as well as, of course, broader threats to HE financial sustainability as a whole. Now, what's happened in my context is, of course, there's been massive over-concentration of risk on mainland China for quite a few years, but the pandemic has then highlighted that vulnerability, and the wider university has started to accelerate their mitigation activities, diversifying away from mainland China quite successfully, with an unintended, I hope, consequence of much lower enrolments on our pre-sessionals, and I'm aware that that's something that's being felt across the sector. And I don't think any of us have completely figured out how we're going to respond to that, but I do think it's clear that we're not going to be able to rely on pre-sessional income to fund what we do in quite the same way that we maybe have been for the past decade or so. Related to this is a second point, which is increasing question marks over what internationalisation really is, who it's for, and questions over whether growth in student numbers, and particularly among international cohorts, is really such a desirable thing. Certainly in my institution, there is a commitment now to not grow for the sake of growth, and it's not just a buzzword, like that it is, you know, I can see it being operationalised. And it relates also to things like the climate impacts of international travel, pressure of high student numbers on our cities, on things like housing, for example. They're all of these things that are driving that. In my institution, it also links with increasing calls to kind of understand internationalisation more about the development of intercultural skills for all students, rather than just a kind of bums on seats, let's recruit more international students. There's also an intensified commitment to widen participation and access, and this is leading to changes in the demographics of our student population. And in my context, and I know in many institutions now, our remit does extend beyond the teaching of international students or so-called non-native speakers, and now extends to teaching EAP to the wider student population. All of this in itself presents threats and opportunities for EAP, and I think it's clear that we can't just react. We have to kind of position ourselves strategically within this new landscape, because the business models that we've been using over the past decade are perhaps not going to serve us very well any longer, and so in order to protect ourselves and protect our communities of teachers, we need to be really thinking about what we're going to do. So I don't pretend in any way to have all of the answers, but in my context, the opportunity that we identified to respond strategically to these sectoral issues was this major change project called the Curriculum Transformation Programme, which was launched by our Vice Principal for Students in 2020. So it's a really long-term strategic change initiative. It was intended to run over 5 years. It's already had its timeline extended by, I'm not even sure what, another 3 years. I'm really thinking about it as process rather than product. What it seeks to do is review the shape, design and delivery of the degree curriculum at all levels of study. Its core aim is to enhance the student experience, of course, and particularly in relation to programme coherence And I'm aware that this is, I think, quite specific to the University of Edinburgh. I think other universities do this better. But in Edinburgh, student learning is really atomised across lots and lots and lots of different courses with very little sense sometimes, or often, I would say, of programme coherence as a whole. Not very much in the way of programme level assessment or capstone courses, or even a sense of a pathway through a programme. So that's the kind of main theme. Other themes are things like good alignment, clear pathways, and supported transitions. So for myself and colleagues, we pragmatically and admittedly completely opportunistically looked at this and felt like there's a lot of stuff here that we can push on as an open door to make the arguments that we'd like to make around academic language and literacies, around the place of academic language in the curriculum. So I consulted quite intensively with teaching colleagues in my unit, and I then developed and proposed a vision, a pedagogic vision for academic language and literacies within these new degree curricula. And I used the governance structures of this project as a way to make my proposals. I focused what I was saying on 3 principles, which you can see on the slide, and I'm pretty sure that you have a good sense of what I mean by these, but I will talk through them kind of in the terms that I used to persuade that wider university audience. So by embedded, I mean that opportunities to develop academic language and literacy skills ought to be completely integrated within the degree learning journey, not peripheral, not bolted on, but part of what in the circles that I needed to make my arguments is sometimes rather unpleasantly called the student life cycle. In terms of inclusive, what I mean by that is that these opportunities should be available to any student regardless of their language learning background. And connected to that, I was able to work in these ideas of internationalisation being about the development of intercultural skills, because if you do have mixed cohorts, that then gives you a really good opportunity to make the case for the development and teaching of interculturality within the EAP sort of teaching space, and that landed quite well. By differentiated, what I was really trying to do with this is make sure that inclusivity was not used as a sort of tokenistic buzzword that could then be a cover for the development of a completely one-size-fits-all provision. So I made the point that actually it is the case that different demographics of students do tend to want or need our provisions more than others, and that's often students for whom English is an additional or second language. But there's also a lot of demand from students, for example, who are returning to higher education from a workplace context. Huge demand from people affected by displacement as well, and for example refugees and asylum seekers who may, in terms of proficiency levels, be very high. So I wanted to just make really clear, I don't want to propose a kind of really neat, everybody does this. There's got to be sort of different levels with which people can engage with the provisions. So then building on that kind of 3 principles vision, I then proposed 3 mechanisms for the embedding of academic language and literacies in the degree programme architecture, and I called these programme embedding, course embedding, and timetable embedding, and I pitched them very much in a hierarchy, a sort of gold, silver, bronze level, working from the top down. And what I mean by programme embedding is that academic language and literacy is taught in credit-bearing courses within the degree programme. So it's not in any way sort of adjunct, non-credit bearing, it is part of the degree. By course embedding, I mean that we're in a course. Works well if it's a capstone course that all of the students are doing, otherwise there's obvious sort of parity problems. I think it's quite a common model where you take sort of like sessions from a course where you do things, but you can also be embedded in learning outcomes or embedded in assessments in addition to having your actual sessions. And then the final level is timetable embedding, which I still think is quite good. You're there in the timetable, you're probably like contextualized to the discipline, you're mapped to the student journey, you're not a kind of completely central bolted on service, but you're not embedded at this sort of like depth. And I'll also be completely transparent. I know I haven't talked very much in this presentation. I haven't done the bit where you talk about your context. I saw people doing that and I was like, oh, I should have done that, but I didn't. I had to send my slides on Sunday. But just for point of information, what we're doing at the moment in Edinburgh, we do have a central general EAP service that anyone can sign up to. But in terms of our work with schools and programmes, most of what we're doing is timetable embedding. We do quite a bit of course embedding, and we're just starting to do the programme embedding. So it's, you know, it's a long-term process. Now, this proposal, both the 3 principles and the mechanisms, were completely endorsed by the governance structures of the curriculum transformation programme, which gives us a mandate to just go ahead and keep exploring and expanding this type of work and figuring out some of the details about what's going to work well, what's not going to work so well, particularly around that principle of differentiation. As an aside, they really liked this, and they liked it because they felt that as a framework of embedding, they could use it for other things that they want in the curriculum, like sustainability, digital literacies, things like that. So I think for me, what's interesting is how easy it was to get endorsement for this, particularly when I had made literally the same arguments, sometimes with the same people, but in different sort of bits of the university's governance structure, and I just hadn't kind of been able to build anything like the same level of enthusiasm. And I do have a couple of quick reflections on why that was. The first thing that I did quite consciously is I had a sort of like light bulb moment just to myself, where I realized that I need to start approaching university groups as discourse communities, and I need to start using the same sort of strategies that we would teach students around breaking into those communities and claiming membership. I need to start using those myself. So I literally got committee papers and business papers and strategy documents, and I read them as genres. I looked at the language, I looked at the structure, I listened to how senior administrators and influencers talk in formal and less formal settings, and I adopted those discursal strategies, and it worked. And it might sound sort of kind of obvious or intuitive, but I share it here today because I don't think it gets said explicitly very often, and particularly for aspiring leaders, I think it's quite important to highlight that as EAP specialists, you actually already have the keys to unlock some of these difficult communication challenges, because it's the things that you teach your students all the time. A second reflection is I think I needed to sort of find the right home for the argument as well. And I think that what I had been doing was saying, oh, please let me do this. This is a really good idea. How can you help me to do it? Whereas instead, through this curriculum transformation project, I was able to turn things around and go, oh, you want to do that? Oh, this is how I can help you do it. And again, it sounds kind of obvious and intuitive, but I don't think we surface this as much as we could when we talk about leadership practice in our field, just how we can use kind of language and argumentation, quite skillfully, in fact. So moving on now, as I said, I do want to think about this quite critically. I do want to think about the threats associated with this involvement with this project, as well as the opportunities there. And the first danger is a kind of perception of complicity in a neoliberal change project. When I had a new colleague joined our centre not very long ago, and I said curriculum transformation, and she said, oh, that sounds really ominous. And I think that trepidation is felt by many academics, because in too many cases, projects like this are used in quite a sort of cynical way as a cover for quite sort of underhand management activities. The example on the slide is a BBC article that some of you might have seen a couple of years ago, reporting that the University of Leicester was closing some English literature programmes under the cover of decolonisation of the curriculum. And so I think sometimes academics, when they hear talk about, well, let's rationalise the programmes, they immediately think about closing programmes, about job losses, or at least threats to their research. And that's really important for us as EAP professionals, because we need to have positive collaborative relationships with those very academics in order to successfully embed what we do in a way that's effective for students. A second threat is a potential loss of, or shifting at least, of professional identity in terms of ourselves as experts in language, as experts in international education, dare I say it, as teachers of language. I know that certainly many practitioners will feel like there's a threat that we're just going to be conflated with generic skills provision and kind of lose who we are. Now, I do think there are ways to mitigate both of these threats. On the first one, certainly in Edinburgh, actually there's lots of academics who are quite enthusiastic about this project, and we can push on open doors first. We don't need to do everything all at once. And even when they are concerned, actually we can, thinking about what I said before about presenting yourself as a solution, we can position ourselves as a way for them to engage in this curriculum change project that they've been told they must engage in a way that actually benefits them and their students. On practitioner identity, I do think it's quite important that we resist attempts to sort of decant language out of what we do. But again, through this project, we can make sure that that doesn't happen through the way that we design our courses and the way that we integrate them into the degree curricula. So to be clear, I don't think that the threats can just be sort of batted away. I do think they're important, but they can be mitigated to an extent. And in my context, the benefits and opportunities really outweigh those risks. The first one is through claiming a space in the degree curriculum, we reposition ourselves within the university in a really powerful way. Again, thinking about Jennifer MacDonald's talk this morning that I know some of you went to, it's a way to counter the marginalisation, the sort of adjunct status of that is occupied by a lot of our in-sessional work, and claim that kind of central place. Can also create more space for ourselves in terms of disciplinary identity and credibility by actually being a subject that students learn along with their other subjects. Connected to that, and going back to the points I made earlier about the sector and loss of income from pre-sessional, I think it's possible that the fee income that accrues to a centre or unit through doing credit bearing in sessional is much more sustainable and stable, as well as also being quite lucrative as compared to a summer pre-sessional. There are benefits for students as well, probably too many to mention, and I want to give you time to talk, but one in particular is connecting to what I said before, the opportunities to sort of rethink internationalisation and think about intercultural skills in mixed groups. And then for us, it allows us to claim new spaces, think about our role in widening participation, in working with much wider and more diverse audiences. And this in turn, ultimately and pragmatically, creates a need for a kind of stable year-round work, which protects our communities of practitioners and offers us a kind of escape route from this reliance on summer pre-sessionals. So that's my context, and I didn't put any citations all the way through, and sorry, that's really small, but these are some of the things that I kind of drew on and sort of influenced my thinking and the thinking of colleagues as we were engaging in this work.